31,000 feet over the Nevada desert, a man in a leather cut with a Hells Angels patch was asleep in seat 8A. His 9-year-old daughter was curled against his shoulder, her hand still holding his. Then the cabin speaker crackled, and the captain's voice came through, and it was not calm. "If there is a combat-qualified pilot on this aircraft, press your call button. Now." 141 people turned to look at each other. Nobody moved. Then a little girl reached up and pressed the button above her father's head, because she knew something about him that nobody on that plane did. And in first class, a man in a gray suit was already standing up to stop him. Before we go any further, I want to know who's riding along with me today. Drop your city and your state in the comments, or your country if you're watching from outside the US. I read them, every single one. And it means something to know that a story like this is being heard in a kitchen in Ohio, and a truck stop in Arizona, and a living room in Manchester, all at the same time, because this is one of those stories that only works if people actually tell it. The man in seat 8A never told it. Not to a reporter, not to a camera, not to anybody at that clubhouse who would have bought him a drink for it. He carried it the same way he carried everything else, quietly, under a leather jacket, where nobody thought to look. So let me tell you who he was. His name was Roland Vance. He was 54 years old. He had buried his wife 9 years earlier, and he was raising a 9-year-old daughter on his own in a small house outside Gresham, Oregon. To 140 people on Flight 2214 that morning, he was a Hell's Angel with a death's head on his back and a reason to move seats. To 3 men on that flight deck, and to 1 little girl in row 8, he was going to be something else entirely. This is the story of what happened at 31,000 feet over the Nevada desert on a gray Tuesday morning in October, and of the man in a $2,000 suit who spent 40 minutes trying to stop it. It starts on a jet bridge in Portland, with a pink backpack. The gate agent at Portland International called rows 6 through 12 at 8:52 in the morning, and a man stood up from the bank of chairs near the window with a pink backpack hanging off one shoulder. He was 54 years old, 6'2", and built the way men get built when the building was never the point. Forearms like bridge cable, knuckles thickened by decades of work and weather, shoulders that filled a doorway without trying. There was silver running through his beard now, more of it every year, and the lines around his eyes had been cut there by 3,000 miles of open road, and by things that had nothing to do with the road at all. On his back, over the worn black leather, sat a patch that most people in that boarding line recognized without ever having seen one in person. The winged death's head, the bottom rocker, Hell's Angels. A businessman 2 rows into the queue looked up from his phone, looked at the cut, and quietly moved 4 places back in line. He did it the way people always did it, casually, like he'd just remembered something, like it was nothing. Roland Vance noticed. He had been noticing for 26 years. Somewhere around year 9, he had stopped letting it land. He was holding a small hand in his left hand. His daughter was 9 years old, and she had picked the pink backpack out herself at a store in Gresham, and there was a juice box in the side pocket that he had been told, in no uncertain terms, was not to be opened before the plane took off. Delphine Vance. Del, to everyone who mattered. They boarded Flight 2214, Portland to Chicago, on a gray Tuesday morning in October. When they reached row 8, Del asked if she could have the window. He said yes before she finished the sentence, and took the aisle. He hadn't looked out of an aircraft window on purpose in 9 years. He stowed the bag. He asked the flight attendant, in a voice much quieter than his frame suggested, whether he could trouble her for a few extra napkins. His daughter was a spiller, and he'd rather have them now than need them later. Then Del said, "Daddy, is this too loose?" He checked her seatbelt. He checked it a second time. Then he checked it a third, running 2 fingers flat beneath the strap. A motion too practiced, too specific. The muscle memory of a man who had once strapped himself into something far less forgiving. There is a shoebox under the bed in a small house outside Gresham, Oregon. Inside it are 2 distinguished flying crosses, a flag folded into a triangle by men in white gloves, and a photograph. That box holds almost everything the man in seat 8A used to be, and he had not opened it in a very long time. Before he was Rolo, he was Deacon. Captain Roland Vance, United States Marine Corps, VMFA 232, the Red Devils. He flew the FA-18 Hornet for 11 years and logged 1,140 combat hours doing it, which is not a number you accumulate by being lucky. Twice they pinned a distinguished flying cross on his chest, and both times he stood there thinking about the men who weren't in the room. There was a night over the Hindu Kush. February, brutal cold. Terrain that will kill you faster than anything an enemy can put in the air. He took a hydraulic failure at altitude and weather, in mountains, with the nearest friendly runway, a long, long way behind him. What he remembered about that night was not the fear, it was a voice. His wingman, calm as a Sunday morning, talking him through it, one item at a time. Say your state. Good. Now put your hands where I tell you. He landed that broken airplane. He never forgot the sound of a steady voice arriving in the dark. And before all of that, a gas station outside Yuma, Arizona, 111 degrees in the shade, a young Marine aviator with a Coke bottle sweating in his hand, and a woman at the next pump who told him his flight jacket was ridiculous in this heat. Her name was Coraline. He married her 11 months later. She was 31 when the diagnosis came. It took 14 months from the doctor's office to the graveside. 14 months is both an eternity and no time at all, and any of you who have lived through it already know exactly what I mean. At the funeral, standing in wet grass in his dress blues, he felt a tug on his sleeve. His daughter was 4 years old, and she asked him the only question a 4-year-old can ask on a day like that. Are you going to go away too? He knelt down in the mud in a $2,000 uniform and told her no. Told her he was done flying. Told her he wasn't going anywhere, ever. And that was the last promise he made to anyone for 9 years. He put in his papers. He came home. And here is the part people get wrong. The leather cut was not a fall from grace. It was a translation. He came back to a country with no use for what he'd been. And he found the only other place he'd ever known where a man's word was a contract, where you were judged by whether you showed up when it was raining, and where nobody ever asked what you did before. Within 4 months, the chapter had him running toys to a children's hospital at Christmas. He never once mentioned the shoebox. Now, before we go any further, I need to tell you something about what happens next, because it's going to make some of you angry. There is a man on this flight in seat 2C. His name is Nathan Kessler. He is a vice president at the airline that operates this aircraft. He is flying home on a company pass, and over the next 40 minutes, he is going to do everything in his power to keep the only qualified combat pilot on that plane out of that cockpit. Not because he thinks it's unsafe, but because of what it might cost the company if it looked unsafe. 141 people, and he was doing liability math. So here's what I'm asking. If you believe a man should be judged by what he does, and not what he wears, hit that subscribe button right now. Nathan Kessler judged him by the patch. Don't be Nathan Kessler. And type "judged by the patch" in the comments, so I know which side of that aisle you're standing on. Nathan Kessler boarded Flight 2214 before anybody else did. He was 47 years old, in a charcoal suit that fit him properly because it had been made to, and he carried a single leather case and nothing else. He said good morning to the gate agent by name, because he had read her name tag, and because he had learned a long time ago that people work harder for you when you do. He was courteous, he was quiet, he had the particular unhurried calm of a man who has never once in his adult life had to wonder whether he'd be allowed somewhere. He was a vice president of operations at the airline that owned the aircraft he was sitting in. He was flying on a company pass in seat 2C to Chicago, where in 2 days' time, he would put his signature on the final version of a cost reduction package he had spent 11 months building, a package that included, among 40 other line items, a modest revision to the mandatory rest window between flight crew duty periods. Remember that. We'll come back to it. Nathan Kessler was not a cruel man. This matters, so I want to be precise about it. He did not hate anyone. He had spent 20 years inside a large institution, learning one lesson so thoroughly that it had replaced his instincts. The correct answer is always the one that creates the least exposure. Not the most honest answer, not the bravest one, the one that, if it ever ended up in a deposition, would look reasonable. 20 years of that, and a man stops noticing he's doing it. He was already seated when Roland Vance came down the jet bridge with a 9-year-old and a pink backpack. He noticed the cut. Of course he noticed the cut. Everyone in that cabin noticed the cut. But Kessler did not stare, and he did not react. And if you had been watching him, you would have seen nothing at all, except a man glance up from his tablet for perhaps a second and a half, and then look back down. What he did do was wait. He waited until boarding was nearly complete and the purser passed his row, and then he touched her elbow lightly and asked, in a low and pleasant voice, whether the gentleman in 8 had been screened. He said it the way you'd say it if you were worried about somebody. He said it with concern in his face, and she said, "Yes, sir, Of course, everybody is. And he smiled and said, "Wonderful, thank you." And that was all. That was the whole thing. He didn't raise his voice once. He never would. 18 inches of reinforced door forward of first class. Two men were running through a checklist they had each run several thousand times. In the left seat sat Captain Warren Hollis. 61 years old, 34 years on the line, and 63 days from the mandatory retirement age that would take his license and hand him a fishing boat in Coeur d'Alene, whether he wanted one or not. He had flown 4 different aircraft types across 3 decades, and he had never bent one, never lost one, never had a day he couldn't talk about afterward. He was a quiet man, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and a wife of 38 years who had already started planning the party. In the right seat sat First Officer Gideon Pryor, 34, sharp as a tack, universally liked, the kind of young pilot the old ones point at and say that one's going to be fine. He had a wife and a son on the way. He was on his 4th flight in 5 days, after a schedule change. I'm going to say that once, plainly, and then let it sit there. He was on his 4th flight in 5 days, after a schedule change. They pushed back at 9:04 in the morning. Portland was gray and low, and the runway was wet, and the aircraft rotated into the overcast and was in cloud for 90 seconds before it broke out into a sky so blue and so absolutely clean that half the cabin made the same small involuntary sound at once. Roland Vance did not look. He never did. Dell looked for both of them, forehead against the window, narrating the shrinking world in a whisper. Somewhere over the Cascades she got quiet. Somewhere past Bend, she gave up entirely and slumped sideways into her father's arm, mouth open, juice box unopened in the seat pocket, exactly where she'd been told to leave it. He sat there for a while with her weight against him, not moving because you don't move. He had been awake for most of 3 nights running. A brother from the chapter had gone into the hospital on Saturday, and Rollo had done what Rollo does, which is show up and stay. So somewhere over eastern Oregon, with his daughter breathing slowly against his shoulder and the engines running smooth, a 54-year-old man closed his eyes and got the first real sleep he'd had in a week. At 9:41 a.m., somewhere over the eastern edge of the Nevada desert, First Officer Gideon Pryor said something to Captain Hollis that Hollis didn't catch. Hollis asked him to repeat it. He never did. Hollis turned his head. Pryor was slack against his harness. Head down, chin on his chest, left hand still resting on his thigh where it had been a moment ago. His face had gone the color of wet paper. Hollis said his name. Said it again. Louder. Nothing. He reached across and took hold of the man's shoulder and pulled him back against the seat. And Pryor's head rolled and stayed rolled. And that was when a 34-year veteran of the airline industry stopped being a captain having a normal Tuesday and started running. He hit the interphone. Flight deck to cabin. Now. Medical. Both of you. 9 seconds later, the purser was through the door. 12 seconds after that, the second flight attendant. There was a doctor in row 19, an internist flying home from a conference in Portland, and she was forward before anybody finished asking. He had a pulse. It was fast, and it was wrong. He was breathing, barely, in shallow little sips. They got an oxygen bottle on him. Then they hit the geometry. Understand what a flight deck actually is. It is a room the size of a closet, with 2 seats bolted into rails, surrounded on every side by switches and levers and circuit breakers, and every single one of them matters. There is no floor space. There is no room to kneel. And you are trying to extract 190 pounds of unconscious adult male out of a seat, past a control column, over a center pedestal, through a doorway 18 inches wide, without any part of him touching any part of the airplane. It took them 6 minutes. 6 minutes is a very, very long time. And while that was happening, Warren Hollis was alone in the left seat, flying the airplane. Then Denver came up on the data link. Weather had closed his primary alternate. Now, here is what I need you to understand, because this is the whole story. People hear one pilot went down and think the other one just flies it. That's not what a co-pilot is. A modern airliner is not flown by a person. It is managed by 2 people, and the workload is split down the middle by design. One pair of hands flies. The other pair works the radios, runs the checklists, programs the box, monitors the fuel, talks to dispatch, and, most importantly, catches the first pilot's mistakes. That second person isn't a backup. He's half the safety system. Warren Hollis had been awake for 11 hours. He was 63 days from retirement. He had 141 souls behind him, and he had just lost half of his airplane. Back in the cabin, nobody knew anything. A woman in row 14 was working a crossword. Two men in 11 were arguing quietly about a football game. A teenager had her feet up. Somewhere near the back, a baby was being walked up and down the aisle by a father who had been walking that same 11 feet for 20 minutes. And then the speaker crackled. It's a small sound. You've heard it 100 times. It means the seatbelt sign, or turbulence, or we're number 3 for the runway. 141 people went still at exactly the same moment, not because of what was said, because of the pause before it, because a captain's voice came on and then didn't say anything for a second and a half. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. If there is a combat-qualified pilot on board this aircraft, please press your call button immediately. And then nothing. I want you to sit inside that silence with me, because everyone on that airplane did. Nobody moved. Not one hand went up. 141 people looked at the seat back in front of them and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was very simple. Airlines do not ask for pilots. Airlines have pilots. That is the entire point of an airline. In row 24, there was a man who had flown Cessnas for 10 years out of a grass strip in Iowa. 400 hours. Tailwheel endorsement, proud of it. His hand did not move an inch, because he had heard the word combat, and he understood that the word had not been decorative, and that whatever was happening up front was not something a Cessna was going to help with. Nobody moved, and the airplane kept flying east. In seat 8A, Roland Vance slept through all of it. I want to be honest about that, because it's the truth, and the truth is better. He did not sit there wrestling with a decision. He did not hear the announcement and go pale. He was 3 nights deep into no sleep at all, sitting up in a plastic hospital chair beside a man from his chapter who had nobody else coming, and when his body finally got the chance, it took it, and it did not let go for a captain's voice or anything else. But Delphine Vance was awake. She had woken up somewhere over Nevada, and she had heard every word. Now, here is what nobody on that airplane knew, and what Nathan Kessler in seat 2C could not possibly have guessed. That little girl had grown up in the back room of a clubhouse full of men who told stories. And the story they told most often, on cold nights, with a certain tone in their voices, was about her father. They told her about the Red Devils. They told her about a night over a mountain range in Afghanistan, with the hydraulics gone and the weather down, and a voice on the radio walking a young Marine home, one item at a time. They told her the call sign. They told her because he never would. And when she was 7 years old, looking for a lost shoe, she had found a shoebox under his bed. She opened it. She was 7. She saw 2 medals she didn't understand, and a flag folded into a triangle, and a photograph. She put the lid back on. She pushed it back under the bed, exactly where it had been. And for 2 years, she never said a single word about it. Not one. Because even at 7, she understood that some things a person keeps under a bed are being kept there on purpose. So when a captain's voice came through the cabin at 31,000 feet, asking for a combat-qualified pilot, and 140 adults sat perfectly still, a 9-year-old girl reached up above her head and pressed the call button. Then she turned and put her hand on her father's shoulder and shook him awake and said 4 words. Daddy, they need Deacon. A 9-year-old girl had more courage in that moment than a vice president in a $2,000 suit. And I want you to remember that, because Nathan Kessler is about to stand up. If you're on that little girl's side, comment, "She knew," right now. Kessler's counting on people staying in their seats. Prove him wrong. He was awake in about 2 seconds. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the lit call button above her head. And then a flight attendant was at row 8, and he was saying words he had not said out loud in 9 years. Former Marine Corps, F days 18, 1100 combat hours, and she was already moving. Already on the interphone, already saying purser to the forward galley. He unbuckled. Dell stood up with him and took his hand, and he did not tell her to sit down, because he didn't have it in him to let go of her yet either. And the two of them walked up the aisle of a wide-body airplane, past 140 people, who watched a man in a Hell's Angels cut go forward, while a captain was asking for a pilot, and every single one of them had a thought about it. He got as far as the forward galley. Nathan Kessler was already standing there. He had his airline identification out. He was holding it at chest height, the way you do when you want it seen without appearing to show it off. He was calm. He was polite. He introduced himself by title. And then he began to talk, And this is the part I need you to hear properly, because Nathan Kessler did not say one stupid thing in that galley. He did not mention the patch. He never said the word biker. He said liability. He said the company carries specific insurance, and that insurance is written around who is qualified to occupy a flight deck seat. He said unvetted individual, a phrase that means absolutely nothing and sounds like it means everything. He said there are protocols for medical events, there is a procedure, dispatch has a process, and the process exists precisely so that nobody has to improvise at 31,000 feet. He said, and I want to be fair to him, that if this went wrong, the exposure would not fall on the man in the leather jacket, it would fall on 141 families, and on the airline. Every one of those sentences was defensible. Written down, in an office, on a Tuesday, they would all pass review. And then he said the last one. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. 2 hours earlier, a man had moved seats to avoid sitting near him. Now a man in a better suit was trying to move him out of the cockpit. Roland Vance had been having the same conversation his entire adult life. It had just never had 141 people riding on the outcome. And here is the hardest thing that man did all day. Not the flying, this. He stayed calm. 6'2", 230 pounds, 1,100 combat hours, a daughter's hand in his bows. And he did not raise his voice, did not step forward, did not give that man one single frame of footage he could ever use. Because he had learned, over 26 years, that a man wearing what he was wearing gets exactly one wrong reaction, and it becomes the whole story. He just said quietly, "Sir, there's a captain up there flying alone." It was Odette Brennan who ended it. 58 years old. 26 years on the line. She had been the purser on that aircraft since Portland, and she took Nathan Kessler's identification out of his hand, looked at it, handed it back, and said this, "Sir, at cruise altitude, there is exactly one person on this aircraft with authority. And he's the one who just asked for a combat pilot. A beat. You're a passenger. Sit down. The flight deck door on a modern airliner is a security device. It is armored. It does not simply open. Odette Brennan called it through." There was a pause on the other end that lasted about 4 seconds, and then the lock released, and Roland Vance let go of his daughter's hand for the first time since Portland and handed her to a 58-year-old flight attendant he had known for 90 seconds. Dell did not cry. She said, "Go on, Daddy." She was 9. He stepped through. Now, put yourself in Warren Hollis's seat for a moment, because I think this is the most important 30 seconds in this entire story, and almost nobody talks about it. He is 61 years old. He is 63 days from a retirement he has spent 34 years earning. He has a spotless record, and a wife planning a party, and a pension, and a reputation. His first officer has just been carried out of that room unconscious. He is single pilot in a wide body, with 141 people behind him, and a closed alternate ahead of him. And the door opens, and what comes through it is a man in a leather cut with a winged death's head on the back of it. Understand what Hollis had every reason to do. Every reason. He had a career to protect, a company to answer to, a lawyer's voice in the back of his head, and 34 years of institutional instinct telling him that the safe play, the career safe play, was to say no thank you and close the door and do it alone. There were 2 men from the same generation, in the same industry, on that airplane that morning. One of them was in seat 2C doing exposure math. The other one was in the left seat, and he asked exactly one question. "What did you fly?" "Hornets. 232. Hollis nodded once. Didn't look at the patch again. "Hours?" 1,140. "Combat." And then the question that could have ended it. The one Rollo could have shaded, softened, fudged by a couple of years, and nobody in the world would ever have known. "When did you last fly anything?" He didn't lie. 9 years, 3 weeks, and 4 days ago, sir. Say that again to yourself. 9 years, 3 weeks, and 4 days. That is not a man estimating. That is a man who has been counting, every day, since a wet graveside in Oregon. Warren Hollis heard it. Whatever else that man was, he was not stupid, and he had spent 34 years reading people across a center pedestal, and he understood in about a second and a half exactly what that number meant and what it had cost. And he said, "Then you remember better than most. Sit down and put your headset on." That was it. That was the whole vetting process. 9 words from a 61-year-old airline captain who had more to lose in that moment than anybody else on the aircraft, and who decided that 141 people mattered more than his last 63 days. Rollo dropped into the right seat. His hands knew where everything was before his brain did. That's the part he told me about later. Not fear, not nerves. The obscene, effortless familiarity of it. 9 years, and his left hand found the harness buckle without looking. He pulled the straps down. He set the shoulder harness. Then he ran 2 fingers flat beneath the lap belt, checked the tension, and settled back into the seat. And out in row 8, a 9-year-old girl sat in the dark of a stranger's arms with her father's empty seat beside her. He never touched the controls. I want that understood, because it's the thing people always get wrong. Roland Vance did not fly that airplane. Warren Hollis flew that airplane, start to finish, hands-on, the whole way down. What Rollo did was everything else. He took the radios, center, then approach. He read back clearances so Hollis didn't have to look away from the instruments. He worked the fuel. He pulled the weather. Denver was closed. Boise was marginal. Salt Lake City was open. 40 minutes out, long runway, full emergency services. He called it. Hollis confirmed it. Done. He ran the checklists out loud, item by item, the way you're supposed to, and the way a man alone simply cannot. He set the box. He briefed the approach. He watched the descent profile and called the altitudes. That is what a first officer is. Not a spare driver. A second brain, running in parallel, catching the things one exhausted man cannot catch by himself at the end of 11 hours. For 40 minutes, Warren Hollis had been missing that. Now he had it back. In the cabin, they knew. Of course they knew. 140 people had watched a man in a Hell's Angels cut walk forward and not come back, and a 9-year-old girl come back alone. Odette Brennan sat in 8A. Dell sat in 8B, with one hand flat on her father's empty seat, the way you'd keep a place. The woman across the aisle, the one with the crossword, reached over and held the girl's other hand. Didn't say anything, didn't need to. 12 miles out. Gear down, flaps set, runway in sight, wet, gray, beautiful. And a caution light came on. Hydraulic system. Now 9 years, 3 weeks and 4 days earlier, over a mountain range in Afghanistan. In weather, at night, a young Marine captain had watched a light exactly like that one come alive in front of him. He did not remember it. He did not flash back. There was no time, and that is not how it works. His hands moved. He was on the panel before Hollis finished saying the word. Isolated the system. Checked the second. Checked pressure. Called the state out loud. Flat. No adjectives. And then he did the other thing. The thing that mattered more. He heard himself start talking, and the words coming out of his mouth were not his words. They were somebody else's. They were a wingman's, spoken into a headset in February, over the Hindu Kush, in the calmest voice a terrified 29-year-old had ever heard. Captain, say your state. Hollis said it. Good. That's good. We're fine. Now, put your hands where I tell you. 9 years, 3 weeks, and 4 days. A man he never saw again, talked him home in the dark, one item at a time. And Roland Vance had carried that voice around inside him ever since, like something in a shoebox. And on final approach into Salt Lake City, with 141 people behind him, and a 9-year-old girl in row 8 with her hand on an empty seat, he gave it away. One item at a time, steady, unhurried, the exact same words. Warren Hollis flew the approach. And somewhere in the last 2 miles, a 61-year-old captain, 63 days from retirement, realized that the calmest voice on his flight deck was coming out of a man wearing a death's head on his back. 2 miles, 500, 1 mile, threshold lights. Fire trucks lined up along the taxiway, with their lights turning, because that's what they do. And every pilot who has ever seen them come over the fence knows exactly what they mean. 400. On profile, on speed. Hollis's hands were steady. Rollo called it down. 300, 200, 100, 50, 40, 30, 20. Main gear touched at 10:26 in the morning on a wet runway in Salt Lake City, and it was not a beautiful landing. It was firm, it was solid. It put the airplane exactly where it needed to be, and it did not ask for style points. Spoilers up. Reverse. The nose came down, and that was it. That was the whole thing. For about 4 seconds, nothing happened in that cabin. 140 people sat completely still, the way you do, because part of you doesn't believe it yet, and part of you is still waiting for something else to go wrong. Then somebody started clapping. I've never been able to find out who. Somewhere in the back, one pair of hands. And then it went through that airplane like something breaking. The whole cabin at once. People standing up before the aircraft had stopped rolling, which you are not supposed to do, and which nobody was going to say a word about that day. Grown men with their hands over their faces. The woman with the crossword, sobbing. The father who'd been walking the aisle with the baby, standing in the middle of it with his eyes shut. And a 9-year-old girl in row 8, on her feet on the seat cushion, clapping so hard her hands went red. They weren't clapping for the landing. They were clapping for the man who went forward. And here is where I want you to stop with me for a second. Roland Vance was sitting in the right seat of that flight deck, 18 inches of armored door between him and the rest of the airplane, listening to it come through the bulkhead. This is a man who had spent 9 years watching people cross a parking lot to avoid walking past him. 9 years of mothers pulling children a little closer. 9 years of restaurants where the service got slow, and hotel desks where the room was suddenly unavailable, and a businessman in a boarding line that very morning who moved 4 places back rather than stand near him. He had never once in 9 years been applauded by strangers. He sat there with his hands in his lap and he did not move and he did not say anything. And Warren Hollis had the decency to look straight ahead and let the man have it. The aircraft came to a stop on a taxiway with the fire trucks alongside it, and Roland Vance unbuckled his harness. He didn't say anything to Warren Hollis. There would be time for that later, and both of them knew it. He didn't wait for the crew. He didn't ask what happened next. He reached up, took off the headset, hung it on the hook the way you do without thinking, and stood up in a space too small for a man his size. Then he opened the flight deck door and walked out into a cabin where 140 people were still on their feet. They were still clapping when he came through. He didn't stop. That's the thing. He didn't raise a hand, didn't nod, didn't look at any of them. A man reached out to shake his hand as he passed, and he went by without seeing it. Somebody was saying thank you, over and over, and he didn't hear that either. He walked the length of that aisle like there was nothing in the airplane but the far end of it, and at row 8, he stopped. Then a 54-year-old man got down on his knees in the aisle of a commercial airliner, in front of a 9-year-old girl who had been holding a seat cushion for 40 minutes, and he put his hands on either side of her face, and he said 3 words, "I came back." That was it. That was all of it. Because here's the thing about that promise he made in the wet grass 9 years earlier, in his dress blues, with the mud soaking through at the knees. He told her he'd never fly again. But that was never what she asked him. She asked, "Are you going to go away too?" The flying was never the promise. The flying was just the thing he thought the promise was made of. The promise was that he would come home. Every single time. Whatever it cost, whoever he had to be that day, however many people were watching him do it, he would come home to her. And he did. He never broke it. Not once. Not that morning either. Dell put her arms around her father's neck in the aisle of Flight 2214, and behind them, 140 strangers were quietly falling apart in their seats. If that got you, share this video with somebody who needs to hear it. Because I promise you, there are people watching this who have been the man in seat 8A. People who got looked at, moved away from, talked past. People whose worth got measured by a jacket, or a tattoo, or an accent, or a bad year on their record. Nathan Kessler is not a rare man. He's on every flight. He's in every office. And the only thing that ever beats him is people refusing to look away. So share it. And comment, "I came back," if you've ever had to prove yourself to somebody who'd already decided who you were. Now I have to tell you, the part that nobody on that airplane knew. 3 weeks later, the preliminary review came back. First Officer Gideon Pryor had suffered a cardiac arrhythmia at cruise altitude. It was survivable. He survived it. I'll come back to him, because his story doesn't end badly. But the review did what those reviews do, which is that it went looking for everything sitting behind the event, and it found something. It flagged a contributing factor, cumulative fatigue, 4th flight in 5 days, following a schedule change. And that schedule change had been generated under a pilot program, a limited trial running on 2 regional bases, reducing the mandatory rest window between crew duty periods. The trial had been designed, championed, presented to the board, and pushed through by a vice president of operations. Nathan Kessler was flying to Chicago that morning to finalize its expansion. Sit with that. He had spent 40 minutes at 31,000 feet standing in a galley, calm and courteous and reasonable, using words like liability and exposure and unvetted individual, working as hard as he knew how to keep the only qualified combat pilot on that aircraft out of a cockpit that was in crisis, because of a policy he wrote. He did not know. I want to be very clear about that, because it's the whole point. He wasn't standing in that galley covering something up. He had no idea. He genuinely, sincerely believed he was doing the responsible thing. And that is exactly what makes it a verdict instead of a story. Nathan Kessler was not a monster. He was a man who had done one kind of math for 20 years and had never once, not for a single afternoon, done the other kind. He could tell you what an unvetted individual in a flight deck seat might cost the company. He could not tell you what 40 minutes of stolen sleep might cost a 34-year-old with a son on the way. Nobody had ever asked him to calculate that, so he didn't. And it nearly cost 141 people everything. There's one more thing. That same week, Kessler filed a formal report. 6 pages. It concerned the events in the forward galley and the presence of an unauthorized individual on the flight deck of Flight 2214, and it recommended the airline pursue action for unauthorized flight deck access. He put Roland Vance's name in it. And Captain Warren Hollis, 61 years old, 40-some days from retirement, with a pension already signed and absolutely nothing left to lose, sat down that same week and wrote his own. It ran 9 pages. He described the medical event minute by minute. He described the single pilot workload. He described the closed alternate and the fuel state and the caution light 12 miles out. He described a man with 1,140 combat hours who ran his radios, his checklists, and his systems, and who talked him through a hydraulic isolation on final approach in the steadiest voice he had heard in 34 years of flying. And then he did the thing that made it stick. He submitted it to the FAA, to the NTSB, and to the airline's own board of directors, on the same day, simultaneously, so that no one at any level of that company could quietly make it disappear. It could not be buried. So it wasn't. Warren Hollis retired on schedule, with the party his wife had planned. Nathan Kessler was reassigned within 4 months. He left the industry inside a year. Nathan Kessler wrote 6 pages trying to end Roland Vance's story. Captain Warren Hollis wrote 9 pages making sure it got told. So, one last thing. If you think Hollis got it right, hit subscribe. Kessler would have wanted you to scroll past this and drop a "Thank you, Captain Hollis" in the comments. 61 years old, 2 months from retirement, and he spent his last weeks on the job defending a man he'd known for 40 minutes. That deserves to be said out loud. So what happened to all of them? Gideon Pryor recovered. He spent 11 days in a hospital in Salt Lake City, and he walked out of it under his own power. He has an implanted defibrillator sitting under the skin below his left collarbone now, and that means he will never fly a commercial aircraft again. 34 years old, and the career was simply over, the way it sometimes is. His son was born that January. They named him Warren. Odette Brennan received a formal commendation from the airline for her conduct on Flight 2214, which is a polite corporate way of saying thank you for telling a vice president to sit down. She framed it. It hangs in a crew room in Portland to this day, and if you look at the wall it's on, there's a photograph pinned just above it. Somebody's back, black leather, a winged death's head. Nobody in that crew room has ever needed it explained. Warren Hollis and Roland Vance have breakfast twice a year. Same diner, off the interstate. A retired airline captain and a Hell's Angel, in a booth by the window, 2 cups of coffee. Neither of them has ever talked about the flight. Not once. They talk about fishing, and grandchildren, and whether the truck's going to make another winter. Rollo never went back to flying. Not 1 hour. He went back to the shop, and back to the chapter, and back to the school run at 3 o'clock. And that December, the chapter's Christmas toy run, the one they'd done every year for 19 years, didn't go where it usually went. It went to the children's cardiac ward at a hospital in Salt Lake City. 41 bikes rolled into that parking lot. Nobody ever explained why. There is still a shoebox under a bed in a small house outside Gresham, Oregon. 2 distinguished flying crosses. A flag folded into a triangle. And the photograph. I never described it, so let me do that now. It's a woman at a gas station outside Yuma, Arizona. 22 years old, one hand up against the sun, laughing at something just off the edge of the frame. There's a third thing in that box now. It went in 3 weeks after Flight 2214. A folded piece of notebook paper in 9-year-old handwriting. I knew. Dell 141 people walked off that aircraft in Salt Lake City. Most of them never learned his name. A few remembered a leather jacket and a patch, and a man who looked like trouble. He never corrected anybody. He never told the story. He just went home and made dinner and checked a seatbelt twice and then a third time. Because that's the thing nobody tells you about the people we're taught to be afraid of. Sometimes they're just fathers, waiting to be asked.